Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our podcast series. My name is Emma Bond.
And my name is Olivia Garcia.
Today, we have a very special episode for you.
Yes, we do. Today, we're going to discuss racism throughout American history through the lens of those who were subjected to lynching.
Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for a tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop.
That was the poem Strange Fruit by Abram Meeropol, which was inspired by a famous photograph from our second story today. But to start, one of the first things I wanted to discuss was how common it was for lynchings to occur, even though it was against state law.
But even though lynchings were technically against state law, that did not stop them from occurring. White mobs would force the jail to release arrested Black Americans to them and then publicly advertise the lynching of these Black Americans for others to attend.
And the state police and government officials wouldn't take any action to protect these people from these crimes.
There were few charges brought against these individuals, and even fewer convictions. Since juries were all white, it was very rare to convict other white individuals for the death of Black Americans.
And it was only recently, in fact, it was this year in February, that lynching became a federal crime. The bill was introduced in the House last year by none other than our Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, who at the time was a senator for California, but the bill had been stuck in the House waiting for a vote.
And it was named the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act after the horrible lynching that caught Americans' attention back in 1955.
It's shocking how long it has taken to make lynching a federal crime.
Absolutely, and Black Americans are continuing to face violence or death at the hands of individuals or even the police today.
So for our episode today, we will look at 3 different stories of Black individuals throughout American history that were subjected to lynchings.
The first story is that of Jesse Washington, a 17-year-old Black man who was lynched in Waco, Texas in 1916.
According to The Undefeated and ESPN Internet Ventures, Jesse Washington was accused of the rape and murder of Lucy Fryer, and as Jesse was illiterate and branded feeble-minded, he confessed to the murder.
A jury found him guilty, and a white mob of 2,000 seized him from the courthouse. He was chained, beaten, and dragged to the town square. Along the way, people threw knives, bricks, shovels, and clubs at him. He was burned alive as a crowd of more than 10,000 people watched, including the town's police chief and mayor. His fingers were amputated for souvenirs, and his fingernails were given as keepsakes. He was then dragged behind a horse until his head came off.
It's so hard to hear stories like these. Not only was he brutally murdered, people watched and were excited to receive his body parts as souvenirs. Even the police chief and mayor, who should have intervened, watched as this occurred.
And Jesse's story was not uncommon for this time. This specific occurrence did gain such national attention that it was one of the movements that helped begin to form the NAACP.
And even though it helped galvanize social justice across America, the town of Waco has continuously struggled to memorialize this event in any capacity, hoping to leave its brutal history in the dark.
In fact, many city commissioners would actively ignore and avoid those who were trying to bring attention to the case.
A common theme that we see in American history of ignoring our past.
Exactly, and no one was ever prosecuted. There are sadly many stories like these, and even after witnessing this, they continued to occur. Now we'll jump ahead to 1930 and the story of James Cameron in Indiana.
According to the NPR All Things Considered story of Strange Fruit, Anniversary of a Lynching, our story starts out with the arrest of 3 young African American men, Thomas Shipp, Abram Smith, and James Cameron, on the night of August 6, 1930.
The 3 men were charged with armed robbery and murder of a white factory worker named Claude Dieter and the rape of his companion Mary Ball. And on the same evening of their arrest, the local police station was overcome by a mob who pulled the 3 men out of jail with plans on lynching them.
However, the mob had plans to take Thomas and Abram to the lynching site first and then come back for James. It's not made clear why they did this, but we can assume that they wanted to ensure that the 3 men weren't going to have any chance to overcome the mob for some reason.
He conducted an interview with NPR in which he tells his story best. After 15 or 20 minutes of having their pictures taken and everything, they came back to get me. Just then the sheriff, and he was sweating like somebody had thrown a bucket of water in his face. He told the mob leader, "Get the hell out of here. You already hung 2 of them, so that ought to satisfy you." Then they began to yell for me like a favorite basketball or football player. They said, "We want Cameron. We want Cameron. We want Cameron."
And it wasn't until he was in the tree and in the noose that somebody from the crowd shouted that he was innocent, and Cameron escaped the lynching. He was brought back to the jail, but was still convicted as an accessory to the crime and spent 4 years in jail.
The case remained open and still remains open. He was pardoned by the Indiana governor in 1993 at 79 years old, 63 years after his conviction. He then died in 2006 at the age of 92.
I think Cameron's story is a perfect example of the sad truth of the crime of lynchings across America. It's crazy to think that those who were leading the mob were never held responsible for their illegal actions, even though their identities were known.
State and local officials were probably scared to try and prosecute these mob leaders and participants for fear of white supremacists rising against them and losing popularity. So lynchings were so normalized, and officials would just turn a blind eye.
And although this case is still disputed, many of these cases are unjustly and biasedly decided by an all-white jury. And although Cameron did get pardoned, it was 63 years after his conviction, and most others who suffered similar lynching terrors were not as lucky enough to be pardoned or only spend 4 years in prison.
And in our next story, we look at a more recent example of these same principles. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police after being pinned to the ground and held down by the officer's knee on his neck for allegedly paying for a box of cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill.
He was held down by his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds before losing consciousness. He spent most of this time crying out that he couldn't breathe and begging the officers for mercy, but was flatly ignored. The officer, Mr. Derek Chauvin, kept his knee on George Floyd's neck even after he lost consciousness for a full minute and 20 seconds after paramedics arrived on the scene.
Here we have a clip of a portion of the body cam footage where you can hear him repeatedly say, "I can't breathe," as the officer is on his neck.
Mama, I love you. Reese, I love you. You got how? So my kids, I love them. Relax. I can't breathe. You're doing fine. You're talking fine. I can't breathe. can't breathe. I can't breathe my face. Please leave my neck. I can't breathe shit. That neck. I'm through. I'm claustrophobic. My stomach hurts. My dick hurts. Everything hurts.
After this clip, Floyd becomes unresponsive.
These 3 officers involved violated Minneapolis Police Department policies and were fired the day after George Floyd's death. Then, on May 29th, charges were brought against only one officer, Chauvin, for third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Later, he would be charged with second-degree murder, and the other 2 officers would be charged with aiding and abetting him.
The 3 officers are still awaiting their trial, but this is a clear example of modern-day lynching.
If you consider the definition of a lynching, it's essentially to kill someone without a legal trial. Regardless of whether George Floyd committed this crime, he never received a fair trial, and it's certainly not a crime punishable by death.
And historically, there has usually been a very outward racial prejudice against the person being lynched. I think that there are prejudices present in this case, even though they are more underlying.
Racism in America has always been present, and although how it looks has changed over the years, it is definitely still very present in our society.
In the case of George Floyd, it's as obvious as comparing the situation to a white male counterpart. In fact, the BBC found that in 2019, African Americans were 23% more likely to be fatally shot out of 1,000 police encounters than their white counterparts, even though they only make up 14% of the population.
This figure has actually been consistent since 2017. It's hard to believe that these injustices have been occurring for so long, and most police officers involved have never been convicted or even charged, similar to our stories from the early 1900s.
Additionally, there are modern-day mobs, per se. Although we no longer see mobs dragging people out of jails in broad daylight or gruesomely murdering people for public view, we see racist rhetoric and ideals forming within an alarmingly large portion of the population.
And these modern-day mobs are ever-growing via the use of social media and the internet in general.
It could easily be argued that most police brutality cases are all examples of modern-day lynchings.
And according to an article from the National Geographic website over George Floyd's death, over 4,400 Black Americans were subjected to lynching between 1877 and 1950. And many historians see these racial violent incidents as an abusive policies as the dehumanization of Black Americans, central to an ugly history of racial oppression in U.S. history.
Overall, these stories show the dark sides of America's history and even its present. It is important for us to learn about these stories so that we can hopefully prevent them in the future.
These stories, while focusing on specific lynchings, point to the broader conversation of racism in America.
And although we've come a long way since the Jim Crow era, we still have so much left to overcome.
It's important to continue talking about these things and understanding our nation's history and how it pertains to our present.
We hope that you learned something today and took away something from this episode.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned.